Okay.
Push the bottom.
Well, the light's on, but you have to push the button.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So loudly enough? Okay. Well, ordinarily I start out with my story, which is that I've well prepared. And when I went to bed last night, I was going over this, and I think I had it all the way I wanted to do it. But I went to sleep, and I had a dream, which I often do. And frequently my dreams leave me perplexed and confused because I can't do what I want to do or find where I am or something like that. And I wake up all distressed and say, wow, I'm glad that was only a dream. Well, this happened to me sometime early this morning. I had a dream, and I was supposed to give a talk, and been asked to give a talk on something that I knew absolutely nothing about. And I was trying to figure it was. There was a big statue of like a 15-foot statue of somebody or something almost like Santa Claus, but it wasn't that, but it was a big joyous occasion. Everything was happy. Kids were having joy and people were singing. And I thought, what in the world am I supposed to do? I don't know anything about this. And I was working up a cold sweat when I woke up. And I said, I'm glad that I woke up, because I didn't know what that was all about. But then another thing that happens to me, quite frequently something is being talked about, and I said it reminds me of a song. Well, I immediately woke up thinking of a song that I haven't thought of for 70 years. And that's true, and it was one it came out right after the end of the Second World War. And I was raised in Nashville, and Grand Ole Opry and country music was what I was raised with. And this little song, which I just remember a little bit about it, was, maybe it will relate in a different way to what I'm talking about today, because the words were, let me think of it just a minute now. There it goes. Where's that pill I'm supposed to be taking? No, I can't think of it. But the song was about the handiwork of God. The atomic power, it was made by the mighty hand of God. And that was a very positive thing. And all of a sudden I realized that's probably what my dream was about, because I'm going to talk about the deadly effects of the atomic bomb and all the destruction it had. And here I was supposed to talk about this in my dream, about this very joyous occasion, and the song came up, atomic power, it was made by the mighty hand of God. The positive effects about it. So anyway, that was my dream. And I woke up feeling relieved because I didn't have to talk about that. But I am going to talk about something, and I call it an elderly show and tell. Here's the show. What the heck is that? Well, you probably think this is a grapefruit. Can you hear me if I put this down? Can you hear me now? No. Okay, I won't. This is a grapefruit, but I like to tell people this. I want you to think of this as being a hunk of plutonium, not uranium, but a hunk of plutonium. And this is about a little less than 15 pounds of plutonium. And this was at the center of the Fat Man bomb, the second one we dropped on Japan, which ended the war. The first bomb was uranium, and we only had enough for one of those, but we learned how to make plutonium, but it required a totally new type of bomb to do it, and within 4 months' time, back in 1944, we learned how to use this stuff. And this, when they learned how to do this, this is what had me called up to come out to Los Alamos. But this is what's in the middle of this bomb. Let me see if I can show you a picture. Whoops. Well, this is a cross-section of the bomb that I worked on, the plutonium bomb. And this plutonium fits right in that red circle. And that's all it was. And this is about half scale. This bomb itself, which is a picture of it in its shell, is about 8 feet in diameter. And this was right in the center of it, and this is what
was so explosive
Ralph?
that
This was so explosive that it destroyed the whole town of Nagasaki and killed over 100,000 people in one blast. Now to give you a comparison, that if you were thinking about how we bombed Germany into submission and destroyed their cities, we may have 40 or 50 of the big B-17 bombers going over dropping bombs. The most they could carry was something like 2 tons or 2-ton blockbusters. That was a lot. If what this one bomb did over Nagasaki had been done by B-17s like we bombed Germany, it would have taken over 10,000 planes to have dropped a load of TNT all at the same time at the same point to do what this one bomb did, just to give you an idea of the comparison of that. So, now going with my story on this, I was born in 1925. In 1943, January 24, I was 18 years old. And I immediately went down to my draft board to sign up for the Army. My dad had been in the Army in the trenches in the First World War, and I thought that's what I wanted to do. And in addition, I like to tell people I was afraid if they drafted me, I wanted to volunteer to make sure I got the Army, which was unusual. Most people volunteered the Navy so they wouldn't have to go in the Army. But anyway, they wanted to know, how come you want to get in the Army? And I said, well, I told them why. And they said, well, what have you been doing? And I said, well, I've been going to engineering school my freshman year at Vanderbilt since I graduated last June when I was 17. And I'd gone summer and winter, and I had now finished my first year of chemical engineering at Vanderbilt in Nashville. And they said, oh, well, I'm sure they said, well, were you making good grades? And well, yes, I was making pretty good grades. And they said, well, go home, we'll call you in a few days. Which I didn't think anything of. I thought this was probably what regularly happened. They called me about a week later and they said, well, Ralph, the Army has its hooks in you, but we're not going to draft you yet. We're not going to swear you in. We want you to go back and stay in engineering school till we call you. I said, well, okay. Now, my dad had died the year before, and mother was left with 4 sons. My oldest brother, I was number 2. The oldest brother was already at college at the University of Illinois. And I just started Vanderbilt. Mother was home, trying to figure out how she could support the family. There's a lot of stuff in that. Back in those days, in 1942, my dad had a very good job. He was plant manager of a plant in Nashville, but they had no pension or something for somebody who died before they retired. And I remember Mother got my dad's salary for the month of March, 12 days until he died. And after that, there was nothing. Well, we'd been through the Depression, so we were okay. But nevertheless, she had to go back to work. She'd never worked a day in her life, raising 4 kids. And she eventually became a teacher and taught until she was 65 and then retired with a nice pension. But they didn't call me right away, and I had no idea why. They didn't call me for a year. By the time they finally called me, I'd finished 3 years of engineering school. And now they said, well, we want you. Well, okay, I didn't know what's for. The war in Germany was still going on. And I thought, well, at last I'm going to get into the fighting. And everybody had to go through basic training, so I was put in infantry replacement training. That's where we needed a lot of bodies. It sounded good to me, sounded okay anyway. That was a 16 weeks program, and then we were going to be shipped over to Europe to get in the battle after the landing at D-Day and stuff like that. And but in the 8th or 9th of December of that year is when the famous Battle of the Bulge started. You remember that? It was the last big German push.
I was in it.
Okay, well they looked like they were going to break through, and all of a sudden they needed bodies in the infantry in a hurry, so they cut our basic training from 16 weeks to 12, and now instead of shipping over the end of January, we're going to go shipped over the 2nd or 3rd of January. And we were out in our last basic training down in northern Alabama, in which they called them mountains down there. It was tail end of the Appalachian Mountains, so it was pretty high up. And it was the 30th of December, and I had sheltered my shelter half with 3 other guys, and we'd made a little tent out in the snow because it was snowing, and we're comfortably sleeping. I remember we had 2 little candles that we lighted in our little tent, fixed tent, and it kept us warm. The temperature was probably in the 20s because it was snowing, but it wasn't terribly cold. But about 4 o'clock in the morning, the sergeant came over to my tent and said, "Gates, are you in there?" I said, "Yes, sir." We spoke very respectfully to sergeants because they really ran things. "Get your stuff together. You got to go back in." "What's the matter, Sarge? What's the matter? What's going on?" I expected to ship over in the next 3 or 4 weeks. Well, next 3 days, really. And he said, "I don't know. I was just told to get you back in as soon as you can." Well, immediately I thought that I was going to have an emergency furlough, that my grandfather, who was now local apprentice, the oldest male in the household after my dad had died, something was wrong with Grandpa, and I was getting an emergency furlough. Sergeant said, "I don't know what it's about. Get your stuff together, go over to the tent, get a cup of coffee, you got to hike back in." "But Sarge, it's snowing like crazy." Hiking back in was 18 miles with a 90-pound pack and a rifle, and in the snow. He said, "I can't help you, we got no transportation. Get the coffee and get going." Well, I went over there, and there were 3 other guys, the same story. Well, they didn't have anything to talk about in the way of an emergency furlough, so I thought, I didn't know what it was, I had no idea. And I didn't know them, but there was something like 15,000 soldiers in basic training up there. So the 4 of us marched back in the snow. We got back in, and I was in a different company. They were somewhere else. I never saw them again. I don't know what happened to them, but I was alone now in my company, and I spent the time the next day reading and writing letters, wondering when I was going to get orders. They'd issued me a brand new uniform, told me to sit tight and wait. Well, the next day was New Year's Eve, and I thought, well, I'm getting bored. Sarge, you think the lieutenant would give me a pass to go into the USO for New Year's Eve? And I got one, and I went in, and I had a wonderful time, New Year's Eve. I actually got back to my barracks, my tent, went to sleep at about 6 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Day. At about 2 o'clock, all my buddies came marching in. All the snow had melted. They were a muddy mess. I was sitting on my bunk in a brand new uniform. "Gates, where are you going? What's going on?" "I don't know. I had no idea." Right now, I feel the hair rise on the back of my neck, which it often does when I tell this. I knew where they were going. They were shipping out in 3 days to go over to Europe. And I wasn't. I didn't know what was happening. And I was very glad when about 5 o'clock that afternoon on New Year's Day, I got orders to get on a train with 4 or 5 other guys, and we were headed for New York. And we were met at Penn Station by an officer in a van. "Where are we going?" "Well, you're going up to New York University, which is up in the Bronx. It's now the Bronx Community College, but it was the engineering school for New York at the time." And I went up there and was ushered into the little suite on the college there, which was going to be my room. I didn't know for how long. And there were 3 double bunks and 6 desks in there. And I found out who my roommates were. My double bunk mate was a guy by the name of Harvey Willard, who just died about 3 or 4 years ago, became a very good friend of mine. And he was an undergraduate physicist at MIT at the time. Now, I was an undergraduate chemical engineer at Vanderbilt. Dick Reed on another bunk over here was an undergraduate chemist at Harvard. Ken Orban was another one who was out to me at Los Alamos eventually, was an undergraduate mechanical engineer at Penn State. We were all technical students. None of us had graduated, all 6 of us. And we were now studying electrical engineering. Well, none of us had ever studied electrical engineering. And if you saw this thing right here, I wanted to show you this. Did you each have a chance to see it? This is what the Fat Man, the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki, looked like without the shell that covered it when it was dropped from an airplane. If you look at this, you see wires all over it. And if you'll notice closely, you can see that there were 32 points of detonation around this sphere. And they all had to detonate at precisely the same instant, so that the shock wave that was created would hit this in the center at the same time like an envelope collapsing about it, because that's what it took to make this plutonium fission and create the chain reaction and explode. That's why we were studying electrical engineering, because we had to know, we weren't going to be doing electrical engineering, but whatever we were doing, we had to be aware of what was going on. Now, I'll tell you how that came important. I was there for a short period of time. We were there during the time Germany surrendered, and I've got some other stuff like that that was very interesting. But along about April, we were put on a train, and all of a sudden, well, there were about 30 of us in this group at New York University. Half of us went up to Presque Isle, Maine, and became associated with the Army Air Corps. A bunch of them became chief engineers on the B-29, which was the new bomber that was built, actually built so it could carry the atom bomb to Japan from several hundred miles away. B-17 could never do that. So they were there. But the other half of us, which included me, went down to Knoxville, Tennessee. Okay, my home was in Nashville. I thought, oh, maybe I'm going to be stationed in Tennessee. So, believe me, I had no idea about the Manhattan Project at all. It was still totally secret. I was down there for one day. After we got off the train, we took a bus, went across the countryside, open countryside, till we came to a sign that said Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Now, Oak Ridge turned out to be the place where they needed the TVA electricity to make the separation of uranium-235, and that was the biggest out structure for working on the Manhattan Project. But I was there for one night and still had no idea what was going on. But that night I walked across the bridge, and coming the other way was a friend of mine, Hugh Richardson, who was from Nashville. He had graduated a year ahead of me in chemical engineering. I remember saying, Hugh, what in the world are you doing in this gosh awful place? The whole Oak Ridge compound was mud and turmoil, construction and everything else. I don't know whether you've read any of these stories about the secret city, the ladies of the secret city who were recruited from all around the country to work on this special government project in the town of Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And it was in full construction and was a muddy mess. And that one night I was there, after I had gone across this bridge and had supper, I went over to, this was in April, I guess, and went over to where there was a tennis court. And the ladies of Park City were all having a big dance outdoor on the tennis court. And I was there for one night, and it was wonderful. I was 19 at the time, and these girls were at most 21 or 22, so it was a wonderful evening. And I remember dancing to one song in particular that some of you may remember. A part of it goes, what makes a lady of 80 go out on the loose? What makes a gander meander in search of a goose? It's not the season, the reason is clear as the moon, it's just Elmer's tune. Remember that song? Anyway, that was the big song that night, which I remember. The next day I was put on a train. Now, when I was at Oak Ridge, that was part of the Manhattan Project, but it was wide open. There was no compartmentalization. Now, General Groves, who was in charge of all this, wanted to compartmentalize everything so nobody knew any more than what they were doing. And this was okay at Oak Ridge. And my friend Hugh Richardson, I asked him what he was doing in this place, and I remember what he said. He said, I'm dogged if I know. I know what I do, but I don't know what I'm doing. Now, I was with him in graduate school after the war, and I found out what he was doing. He was an operator on the gaseous diffusion plant that was concentrating uranium-235. He knew what he was doing, but did not know what it was for because of compartmentalization. That's why the whole Oak Ridge was open, and there were no guards. I went in and had a wonderful time dancing. The next day, I was put on a Pullman car with about 8 other guys, and we were sealed up in the Pullman car. And I mean sealed up. We were not out of that car, had no contact outside. All our meals were brought into us for 4 nights and 5 days, and we headed west. The train left Knoxville, Tennessee, and went up to Louisville. We were switched off to another train that went over to St. Louis. And we switched probably to the back end of the original Santa Fe Chief. And we thought, hey, at last we're going to the Pacific. We're going to get into war. But it was about 4 days later that they stopped out in the middle of the desert in New Mexico and detached our car, and the train went on. All our meals had been brought into us, and I discovered later on when the train made certain stops, there was one guy who was corporal. He would get off and make a particular phone call. "This is Corporal Hall reporting. My shipment is intact, and no one has approached us." And the answer came back, "We'll get back on the train." The whole purpose of that was to make sure that nobody suspicioned why this carload of young guys, all technically trained, were headed together like that. Well, the train stopped at Lamy, New Mexico. They detached our car. The train went on, and pretty soon a bus came up and picked us up. "Where are we going? Where are we going?" The driver said, "Shh, you'll find out." "Are you familiar with Santa Fe? Any of you been down there?" "Well, outside of Santa Fe is Lamy. That's where the Santa Fe Railroad stops. It does not go through Santa Fe. That's where this bus picked us up, and the train went on to Los Angeles." Pretty soon the bus, we saw a sign that said Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'd heard of Santa Fe. I'd never been there. But my first recollection of thinking was, well, hey, there must be a military base around here somewhere. Well, except we drove right on through Santa Fe, went up north of that along the Rio Grande River to the town of Espanola, where there was the only bridge back then which would handle a big busload like this. We crossed there and came down the other side to a gravel road, turned up into the mountains. Pretty soon we came to a sign, to a fence, and there were a couple of guards there, and they checked our orders. "Where are we going? What's going on?" "Shh, you'll find out." I think we were wondering what was going on to us, happening to us, and every few minutes we'd ask the driver, "What's going on? Where are we going?" And "Shh, you'll find out." I heard it 20 times. Anyway, after we went through that first game, now we came to a big fence with a whole beehive of activity going on behind it, and the fence had a big sign up above and said, "The Los Alamos Ranch School for Boys." And that's where, when I got beyond that fence, I didn't get out, and nobody knew where I was till the war was over. And now the next day, I was ushered into a big room, and the guy had a big blackboard, and he drew a great big circle like this here, and said, "This is why you're here. We're building a new type of bomb." And that was interesting, but we had been dropping what they call 2-ton blockbusters, which was all the B-17 could carry to destroy Germany. And this guy said, "We're building a new type of bomb, which is equivalent to more than 10,000 tons of TNT. Actually, it worked out to be 22,000 tons of TNT. It was much more powerful than I thought. I remember thinking about that. Comparison to something like this, it doesn't make any sense. In today's vernacular, as a young kid at 19, I probably would have said, "Yeah, right." But I was in the military doing what I was told, and the next day I was sent out to a place called S-Site. And we were told, once we got in the fence at Los Alamos, exactly what was going on, that we were working on this new bomb, and none of us were going to get out till the war was over. None of us were going to have any contact directly with anybody, family or girlfriends, or boyfriends, I guess, but I did correspond with my mother and with my girlfriend back in Nashville, but I would send them letters, and I had to send them opened so the censors could see if I was giving anything away that might have been considered interesting information to the enemy. And when they sent a letter back to me, I didn't get it till they'd opened it and read it. So we didn't get too personal anywhere along the way. But that was the way they kept it, and my mother and my girlfriend just knew I was a post office box number. That's all it was. They didn't know where I was until the war was over. Well, the next day I was sent out to what's called S-Site, and that's where I wound up with the job of casting high explosives, which were very important in the design of this Fat Man bomb. See this little section up here? That's a lens. And right up here, right up at the top, was one of 32 detonation points around this sphere, which was about 8 feet in diameter. And the shock wave that started here, when you throw a pebble in the water, the shock wave goes out concentric around that. You understand that? It goes here and the circles get wider and wider. It's concentric around that point. Well, if you exploded right here, that shock wave would be concentric around it. Okay? But before it gets down here to the plutonium, you want to have that shock wave this way, so that the envelope of high explosives would be compressing equally around this grapefruit-sized thing, which incidentally was not exactly in this shape, but anyway, so that it would compress it equally around, and that was what it took to make it go supercritical and get the explosion, the chain reaction started. So the problem was, how can you convert this shock wave this way to this way? Well, that's what we were casting. They're called lenses. This is all TNT around it. This is TNT, well, actually it was barium nitrate that was with it, and the barium nitrate slowed the burning rate down. We think of this as all being an explosion, but this stuff exploded more slowly than this, so that the shock wave, which was like this, as it got down here, it was turned this way, so that when it got here, the shock wave had now turned the way you wanted it to. And this was all pure TNT around here, so that whole envelope converged equally around this, made it go supercritical, chain reaction started, and the thing exploded and destroyed Nagasaki. So, does that make sense to you? This was called the principle of implosion. It was a brand new word, and when I was discharged from the Army, I was giving a debriefing and told never to let the word implosion cross your lips. It was a whole new concept. Well, people after the war, they knew about Los Alamos then and Oak Ridge, and they, where were you? I was in Los Alamos. What'd you do? Well, I was just a GI. I finally wound up as a sergeant, just doing what I was told to do. So nobody knew what I did until about 2 years after the war. I had now finished my degree at Vanderbilt, and I'd gone off to MIT to grad school. And I was up there in the fall of, I think it was 47, and here came an issue of Life magazine. Do you remember Life magazine? Wonderful magazine, and it had a whole story about this plutonium bomb, written out. Everything that I'd been told was secret was known to the Germans before we exploded the first bomb. We found out later on, because of the spies that were in Los Alamos, one guy's name was Klaus Fuchs. His story is a very interesting one. He was a German communist. And communists to Hitler were as bad as Jews. And they were all being executed as fast as they could do. Klaus Fuchs, he was a wonderful physicist. He escaped to England and worked up there, and eventually went to New York University, and then came out to Los Alamos, and is one of the principal, not the top ones, but one of the very prominent scientists who helped devise this implosion technique. But he was also a communist. And he felt he wanted to do everything to help Russia defeat Germany. You know, we were supporting Russia. He was a communist. He wanted to help